Good evening, that's better. My name is Daniel Burke. I'm the chairman of Meyler Campbell, and on behalf of the faculty and our chief executive, a very warm welcome to this year's Meyler Campbell annual lecture. In a moment, I'll be introducing our distinguished speaker, Geoff Mulgan. Geoff will speak for around 45 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for questions. And that will be followed by a drinks reception next door, sponsored by our generous hosts and friends from the Alliance. So, turning to Geoff, you'll probably be delighted to know, particularly in the current climate, that Geoff has a positive view about our future. Geoff is the CEO of NESTA, which is the UK's National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And he's a senior visiting scholar at Harvard University's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. He was the founder of the think tank Demos and director of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and head of policy under Tony Blair. His books include The Locust and the Bee and Good and Bad Power. And he also co-founded Action for Happiness, which is a movement of people committed to increasing happiness and a more caring society. And his latest book, Big Mind, is all about how collective intelligence can change our world. The purpose of the Meyler Campbell annual lecture is to bring each year a world expert in their field to shake us up in ours. And I'm very confident that Geoff will do that. So without more ado, I'm delighted to invite Geoff Mulgan to give the Meyler Campbell Annual Lecture 2018. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and this mic is working. And first of all, thanks for the invitation to come and join you on a dark November evening as the country goes through a nervous breakdown, which we're not going to talk about at all this evening. I have some involvement in... Can you put it back one? Yeah. I'll control them. Both your sort of angles here. So I have been a coach. I've had coaches. I get most of my staff to use coaches. I've even encouraged coaching in schools. So I'm good for the industry in that respect. And also have had some involvement in leadership. And actually, I quite often teach leadership to a fairly wide range of groups from 20-year-olds in places like Manchester and Luton and London, through to a fascinating institution called the China Executive Leadership Academy. In China, they have the very weird idea that you should train your leaders, your ministers and mayors and governors, and that you shouldn't be assumed to know how to do those roles. Here, we assume you just sort of make it up as you go along when you're appointed to the cabinet. Anyway, one day in the future... we may copy the Chinese. There's many things we don't want to copy from the Chinese, but that's one of them. So because you are all experts on coaching and leadership, I'm not going to say anything more about those, but talk about some things which are, if you like, orthogonal to your work, and I hope provide some new ways of thinking, some maybe new questions, and certainly later on I'm going to share some new data, which you won't have seen before because it's not been published, which I hope then will lead into a discussion. So the starting sort of title I was given was the future integration of human and machine. And I thought I'd start with this little picture, which was a picture of me very foolishly having an implant put into my hand. You can't see the blood, which then sort of spurted out, rather embarrassingly. But this was a little chip. And actually, can I just do a quick show of hands? How many people in this room have a chip inserted into you of any kind? No cyborgs in the audience. And I partly did this really just to help me think about a future where we are increasingly integrated with machines. And this is a future which we already have in the present. That picture up at the top there is about exoskeletons. We're actually running a big program now with Toyota on AI-supported alternatives to wheelchairs, new technologies which help people be mobile, which are advancing very fast. This guy, actually, this is not quite, but he has a passport picture with this implanted sensor on his head, officially recognized by the Home Office, a sort of new species of human being with implants. And this is a sort of made-up picture, but really, which was to illustrate a news story about, I think it's about a third of under 30s could quite happily picture themselves dating a robot. So we have quite near ahead of us a future where we will be living surrounded by smart machines of all kinds, where within the workplace, the challenges of office romances become even more interesting if they're romances with the robots. But where my prediction would be, almost whatever else happens, we will increasingly be using machine technology, not just through your smartphones, and many of you a few minutes ago looked fairly inseparable from your smartphones, but you may be literally inseparable from devices which help enhance your memory, your observation. And for the purposes of this field, the sorts of things which I think will be mainstream in the fairly near future will be AI enhancements to your site so you can spot the emotional patterns of people in a meeting. Facebook already diagnoses some of the warning signs of suicide through social media behavior, and there's also facial analysis software for that. Tones of voice, again, you may have enhancements to your hearing, so you can interpret some of the signs of the mood, feelings, anxieties of a group. Anyway, there are lots of ways in which, in literal senses, we will see a future integration of humans and machines with all sorts of opportunities, but also all sorts of dilemmas and challenges. What I'm going to talk about, though, is something in some ways a slightly different sense of integration of humans and machines, which is really about how thought happens at scale. And I think much of what I hope you do in your daily life, in a sense, is about how you nurture people, how you realize their potential to realize the greater potential of the organization they're part of or the field. So in a sense, your task is making thought, cognition, emotion happen at larger scales. And what I've been fascinated about for a few years is how this will change, what opportunities will there be for us to think about thought in radically different ways than we do now. Now, one of the prompts for this, of course, is artificial intelligence, which is all over the news, newspapers, organizations, Google DeepMind just up the road in King's Cross, IBM Watson, driverless cars. China, I think, is actually leading the way. If any of you used Smile to Pay, possibly the most dangerous invention of recent history. You go into a shop and you pay, and your account is debited automatically. And indeed, money is almost unusable now in some Chinese cities. This has moved so far. So AI is sort of forcing all sorts of new ways of thinking about technology, and my organization is an investor in a number of companies in the HR tech world using technology for recruitment and assessment and so on. But because that's so familiar, I'm going to talk about the bit which is perhaps less familiar, the field which was really initiated by this cow. Do any of you know the story of this cow? So this was Francis Galton, a scientist, English scientist in the late 19th century, who went to a country fair and observed that where you had to sort of guess the weight of an ox, that the average of 800 people's guesses was almost exactly the actual weight of the ox. And this led to the idea that, in the right circumstances, crowds, groups can be smarter than any individual within the group. The experts and farmers couldn't guess as accurately as the crowd could. And out of that has developed a whole field. This is an example which I didn't even realize a few years ago was a great one of collective intelligence, which is the Oxford English Dictionary, which in the mid-19th century, even before Francis Galton, in fact, when a group of people set out to try and map the English language, they realized it was far more complex than any one individual could do. And so they mobilized armies of volunteers, tens of thousands of volunteers, to read up the entire corpus of English literature going back to the Middle Ages, writing down the words, the meanings of the words, the references, and so on. And eventually that created the OED. An extraordinary exercise of creative collective intelligence. And Wikipedia, more than 100 years ago, essentially used exactly the same methods, but helped by the internet. They didn't give any credit to the OED, unfortunately. Anyway, so this field has spread with all sorts of experiments and applications. So NASA has been one of the leads doing this, and I'll say a bit about NASA later as well, as a very interesting organization that thinks hard about how to get the best out of its people. I mean, one of the experiments they ran was a series of things called red balloon challenges, where they hid red balloons randomly across the US, you can see the map there, and really challenged people to come up with methods of finding those balloons. And it's worth reflecting, what would your method be to find a balloon which could be anywhere in Britain, and you've got to find it in a few hours. Each time they did this, all the balloons were found within, I think, less than 10 hours. And always what the teams designed were clever ways of mobilizing thousands of strangers to want to scout around, hunt around, share tidbits of information to find the balloon. So it was an experiment in mobilizing crowd intelligence. There's also now lots of examples in health. This is Dana Lewis, who became very frustrated with the medical profession in helping her find an artificial pancreas. And so she created a community of co-inventors and co-sufferers to both invent an artificial pancreas and then share their data to help guide it. One of now many, many examples of often citizen-driven collective intelligence doing things which the official system can't do. And these are just a few live examples of collective intelligence now. Duolingo is probably some of you in this room. Anybody use Duolingo? Heard of it? A few, yeah. So it's a free online language learning app. It's actually quite good. And it uses, again, tens of thousands of volunteers to write new language pairs, like Spanish to Mongolian. So it's a clever combination of, in some ways, a classic sort of service design and a business, but with collective intelligence added on. Galaxy Zoo is a great British innovation, 1 million plus people helping astronomers scan the skies to spot new stars. An example of citizen science, which now many, many millions of people take part in these projects, amplifying what can be done by traditional formal science. This is a symptoms network, people with Parkinson's, one of many in healthcare where patients, as it were, have come together, as in the example of Dana Lewis, to learn and solve and co-create and even commission research together. And this example is from Madrid, which uses some technology which we helped design at NESTA to actually involve citizens in making decisions. And the Decide Madrid platform allows any citizen of Madrid to propose ideas, then to have a deliberative process of commenting on other people's ideas, prioritizing them, and so on, including how to spend large sums of money. This is one of the 100 million euro allocations they made. And it's an example of reinventing democracy as collective intelligence, rather than yes-no referendums, which aren't always the best way to make decisions. And say Barcelona uses this, Helsinki, about 90 cities around the world have adopted this collective intelligence approach to democracy. We now have a little center for collective intelligence design in NESTA, and one of the things we've been doing is making sense of this global field of new research on crowdsourcing, citizen science, and participatory research. And this is all online, if you like, and we're trying to create really a global community of people experimenting with these methods. One aspect of this, which I particularly like, is meeting design. And indeed, one of the chapters in my book people most like is the chapter on meetings. which in some ways just tries to bring together what we know from the science of meetings. It shows that 99% of meetings in business, government, and even worse, academia, completely ignore everything which is known about meetings. It's an extraordinary fact, which I still don't quite understand, why all of these institutions literally ignore all of the evidence. And if you're interested, tomorrow we're hosting at lunchtime at NESTA a psychologist who did, I think, one of the most interesting pieces of research on collective intelligence and meetings, where they tasked different groups with solving a problem together. And out of this came 3 key criteria for a successful problem-solving team. Can any of you guess what the 3 key predictors of success at a collectively intelligent problem-solving team would be?
More women.
More women was one of the, that was the third. Any others?
More difference.
More difference? It wasn't quite, because difference can be, it's the right kind of difference, actually.
Shares of airtime.
Shares of airtime. Turn-taking turned out to be absolutely crucial. If the most powerful people hog the time, you end up with a stupider group. And one last one, yeah. Sorry? Well, it was sort of listening. It was an empathic sort of personality which made you good for listening, yeah. So, but you all got it. This is obviously a very smart group. So anyway, Tom Malone, who did that piece of research, is speaking at NESTA tomorrow lunchtime. And we've looked a lot at all the different meeting structures and which ones actually get the most out of a group and which ones don't. And as I said, probably you don't ever go to academic conferences. I do quite often. And they're astonishing in how badly designed they are to actually make the least out of the people in the room, not the most. But we can come back to that one. So over the last few years, we've been trying to make sense, both of theory and practice, of what makes a group, an organization, a city, a nation more intelligent and collectively. And to do that, we've sort of tried to break down some of the things which go on in your brain, hopefully, most days, which make you smart as a human being. And it tends to be, the ability to actually observe and see things as they are, the ability to analyze, to make sense of things, to predict, creativity, memory, empathy. This is sort of the list of things which go to make up intelligence. And I think that we can apply this sort of analysis to any organization or to a city or to a nation. Look, how well does it do these things? And often we find huge imbalances. Organizations may be fantastic at data analysis, but absolutely hopeless at organizing wisdom. And indeed, often financial institutions are cursed by this. They're great at short-term analysis, and then they completely forget there's a thing called the business cycle, and so when a recession comes, they're all shocked. Other organizations, may have too much memory, may live in a sort of eternal past. Others, oddly, may be too creative. They're so focused on the new ideas, they're not very good on implementing the old ones. So anyway, this provides a bit of a lens for thinking about organizations and how they work and their imbalances. And of course, technologies are very powerful for some of these, very powerful tools for observation, in some ways quite good tools for memory. You can Google search or have archives, but much less good so far for these bottom 4. As a result of which so many of the really useful applications of technology have to combine the human and the machine to let the machines do what they do well, but often integrated with people. So here's some examples. This is one of many examples where cities are trying to create a collective intelligence way of seeing themselves. This is Jakarta in Indonesia, which gathers together the formal data from sensors, traffic analysis, and so on, but also allows citizens to generate their own data on things like flooding, because there's more citizens than government officials. This is more efficient than just relying on the government officials. They also look at social media, so they can see what people are talking about on Twitter and so on. But then obviously have human beings to try and make sense of which ones matter, which ones are imminent crises, which ones require response. Creativity is the same. So we run a thing called challenges.org at NESTA, which tries to open up problems to anyone to solve anywhere in the world, ranging from, well, I mentioned the ones on alternatives to wheelchairs or antibiotic resistance, and so on. But again, this is a combination of platform-based technology, but then always we try and have very intensive processes of helping people improve their ideas, test them, nurture them, develop them, and so on. I mentioned NASA before. I think NASA is a really interesting organization which has sort of turned itself inside out from the Apollo years. And these are all examples of ways they try and mobilize ideas and ingenuity outside NASA. For everything from designing spacesuits to software for guiding rockets to even making a corporate video. All of these are done through crowdsourcing, collective intelligence tools. And it's a fascinating example. No British public organisation has gone anywhere near as far as them in terms of reinventing themselves in this sort of collective intelligence mould. And then, of course, there's technologies for memory. This is one of my favourite ones, initiated here in London, Wiki House, which tries to organise the world's memory of how to build houses. And you can go on to Wiki House, find easily used architectural designs which you can use, and then if you're a good person, if you use them, then you put back into the database the adaptation which you had done. So it's kind of organising the global memory around something quite simple, housing, using very simple, cheap technology. I mentioned that. And then finally, judgment. So I think there's a really interesting thing going on in healthcare. And with all of these, I'm partly asking you to think, what's the equivalent in coaching and leadership of these sort of tools? So in healthcare, there's lots more use of collective intelligence tools within the discipline, like epistemonikos, which tries to bring together essentially the global knowledge of what works or what doesn't in medicine, but combined with human judgment and commentary. The Cochrane collaboration does that in a more formal way. This is the European Society for Medical Oncology, which tries to, again, organize professional fields, but in much more systematic ways, where the knowledge, the experience is orchestrated, transparent, structured, not, as it were, just organized through anecdote or sort of secret gatherings. And the idea is a collective intelligence support for judgment. Now, one of the crucial places this then takes you to is how learning happens in organizations. And one of the things that I write about in my book is how learning loops take place. And in some ways, this is a very simple idea. In some ways, not so simple. And essentially, I argue that any kind of learning you can think of as happening in three loops. The first loop is where you have an existing framework, as it were, a theory of how the world works, and some new data comes in and you change what you do. So if you drive your kids to school and 2 or 3 days in succession one road is blocked with too much traffic, you probably adjust your route and drive a different way. And we do this all the time. This is a large part of human life is that kind of first loop learning. Second loop learning is where that doesn't actually help you meet your goal. So in the case of driving children to school, it may be there suddenly becomes a big issue on air quality. And everyone's worried about the effect of cars on what air kids are breathing in. That then requires you to create new categories to think with. You look at every aspect of your journey through this new lens of air quality. And third loop learning is when you actually have to rethink how the system thinks. We may be seeing this in the next few years with driverless cars. They are, in a sense, a new system of cognition about driving, and especially when they are integrated with driverless cars and human cars, we will see cities needing to combine artificial intelligence and collective intelligence to manage traffic flows and so on. Now, one of the things about these three loops, which is, I think, key for anyone concerned about organizations, is that technologies at the moment are very powerful assistants for first loop learning. nearly all artificial intelligence is essentially first-loop learning. We're yet to have really any computers which can invent categories. There's little flickers of it, but very, very little. And so almost the biggest risk of some of the organizations which make most use of technology is they get stuck in first-loop learning and don't realize when in fact they have to move on to second-loop learning. And the technologies are completely incapable of doing on their own the third loop without human help. And I would guess a large part of the daily job of coaching in some respects is knowing with the people you're working with and the problems they're facing, are they first loop, second loop, or third loop problems? Because if you address a problem at the wrong level, you almost condemn people to failure. Anyway, that might be a topic for us to discuss. So the big area which we're moving on to work on is what I call intelligence assemblies. And I think this is going to become a large part of how organizations think in the future. Essentially, just as your brain connects your observations, your memory, your creativity, and so on, I think we're increasingly going to look to people and organizations which can integrate all of these things, the observations, the data, analysis, memory, with action and three-loop learning. And I'm going to briefly show some examples of what that means in practice, then apply it to the world of work, and then I will shut up. So here's a first example of an intelligence assembly, which some of you probably used to get here, and I would guess most people in this room have used in the last couple of days. Google Maps is an extraordinarily useful tool. What people don't often realize is that Google put it together from many parts. They didn't actually have the skills to do Google Maps. They bought up a whole series of companies with things like scrollable screens and satellite view and street view. They used an open API, so thousands of developers integrated Google Maps into other websites. And then they had Google Map Maker, which allowed the public to fill in missing bits in Google Maps. So it's an assembly of multiple elements to make something useful. Now, there are some other examples in other fields of this kind of attempted assembly. These are a few examples from the environmental field of attempts to link together observations of the world's forests and seas, analysis of trends, predictions of what might go wrong, and then in theory looping this back into practice, action, and learning. You all pay for this one, Copernicus. About 8 or 9 billion euros pays for this one in Europe. Though I think it's, in a way, an interesting example of what can go wrong. It's technically brilliant, fantastic observation and data, but not linked into practice and learning at all. So I think much of that, I won't say a rude word about the EU, but that is one EU project which is sort of half brilliant and half terrible, and a real waste. And yet it's a sign of where we could go in the future. This is AMY, which helps with medical epidemics. So they try and mobilize observation of new epidemics, like Ebola or TB and dengue fever, feed it into smart technology to predict how those might spread, and then work with public health workers to act very quickly to stop the epidemic spreading. It's trying to create a global collective intelligence assembly around dangerous epidemics. And this one does the same for antibiotic resistance. They measure or analyze the state of the genome of bacteria on underground systems. This is a map of the New York underground systems sort of pathogens, which include quite a few plague pathogens. The people working on this project stopped going on the underground systems after a while. Anyway, they've got about 80 cities around the world, again, creating this living map of the state of the sort of genome of bacteria, because this is something which could lead to tens of millions of deaths in the near future if antibiotics stop working. So these are all examples of assembling a different kind of intelligence. And this is just the only other one I'll show on democracy, which fascinatingly has been invented in Taiwan, which wasn't even a democracy a generation ago. But this has been introduced in the Taiwanese parliament and government, a way of making decisions which stands in such stark contrast to our governing systems that it's worth looking at. So they try and break any issue down into these stages. A first stage of getting the facts. Shocking. The ministries have to publish what they think are the facts, but so do academics, campaigning organizations, and so on. Then they have a stage of large-scale deliberation, looking at personal reactions, emotions, images, how people feel about these facts. And then an interpretive stage, looking at meaning, values, significance, with face-to-face meetings, online gatherings, and so on. And then finally, government, parliament decides, enacts, legislates, but having drawn on the intelligence, the experience of a far wider number of people in a far more open, deliberative process than we have in our parliament. And to me, this is a good example. It's an experiment still, though it's going pretty well in Taiwan, of applying the sort of collective intelligence sort of method, mindset, to something like passing laws. So the final bit I'm going to talk about is what this might mean for the world of work, skills, leadership. And what I'm going to share with you is very much a work in progress, but I actually think this is a field where there is huge potential for some quite big advances. And I'm going to start off with some work, you probably can't see that, which we did last year, looking at the US and the UK, trying to make some predictions about which jobs would increase, which ones would shrink, what skills would be looked for. Sadly, a few months ago, Ivanka Trump tweeted this research positively, which has completely undermined any credibility. But it is actually a serious piece of work, I promise you. Whoa! And that just fell apart. One of the things it does is look, by a lot of detail at likelihood of growing and shrinking of all sorts of different occupations, and trying to make that then available to people so they can make sense of their own vulnerability to automation. We also looked at which skills are most likely to be in growing demand by 2030, using a mixture of expert groups and machine learning analysis. And these came out very strongly from the data. Likelihood of growing demand for judgment, fluency of ideas, systems, originality. You can read them all. In a way, this is perhaps not so surprising to a group like this. It is a bit of a shock to our education department, which has arguably squeezed most of these out of the school curriculum. I'm being a bit unfair. In a way, some of the direction of travel in both schools and universities has been to marginalize these things in favor of some knowledge transmission, even though very strong reasons for thinking they will be in greater demand. And perhaps more predictable are the ones with likely shrinking demand, many of them about physical strength, physical control, and even things like night vision, which you probably all have, you're seeing in the dark right now, and glare sensitivity. We also looked, I think this is more interesting perhaps for where this takes one, at which current occupations are likely to have which key additional complementary features in the next 10 or 15 years. So if you're in a customer service occupation, these are the things you might really want to try and emphasize if you're going to make yourself more employable. So judgment, decision-making, fluency of ideas, originality. So don't just work in a shop, but become the person who's quite good at thinking about what you put in the shop window or new ideas. Similarly for, if you're in the construction trade, think about, I have no idea what gross body equilibrium is actually. Somebody here must know. But it might be sales and marketing. Try and combine your core skill with those. If you're in business, media, public service professionals, actually get a bit of science, operations analysis, and again, originality. Now, these may not be completely true, but I'm fairly certain they're right in broad direction. And then we also looked at what jobs don't exist now, but probably will exist in 10 or 15 years' time, and try to look at, again, some of the elements that might be in them. And this was the top one was fine arts, originality, design. And this is quite surprising because most people assume the things which are likely to be in greatest demand are things like AI programming or very technical or technological skills. Now, those do matter in all sorts of ways, but paradoxically, the way economies work is that the most dramatically growing sectors with the fastest growing productivity often have reducing numbers of jobs, not rising numbers of jobs. So manufacturing dramatically increased productivity in the last 50 years as its job numbers fell. And the same is happening to a degree to digital. So these are the closest existing UK occupations to new ones, since we don't know what the new ones are. So it is actually things like window dressing. Who'd have guessed that? Florists, great, industry of the future. Chefs, sales supervisors, retail and wholesale. Pubs apparently are going to do really well. This may not surprise you, but this comes as quite a surprise to many people working in thinking about jobs, because we have these very linear assumptions about how technology or automation will affect things. And then this tries to show this as a correlation between, this is the change of importance of these roles in roughly the last 15 or 16 years, and this is the likely change in future demand. So things like therapy and counselling, medicine, customer and personal services coming out really well. And actually, oddly enough, design and engineering technology reduced in the last 10 or 15 years. Very, very surprising compared to, I say, conventional wisdom. And I think that we published this a few weeks ago, much more detailed, granular analysis showing, for example, a lot of this was looking at the role of creativity in jobs likely to grow, but that if you are a creative person or a creative job, if you can combine it with project management and organizational skills, then you'll be really well placed for the future. And I think this is where this becomes most useful, is thinking about combinations which are future ready and so on. And again, this is stuff we're publishing almost weekly at the moment. We've analysed 40 million job adverts to break them down by skills component in order to look in detail at the value of different skills generated from the data. And so these are actually IT skills up here, and these are business admin, science and research. And we can now, if you dig down into it, see in, say, a lot of detail what the labour market's actually demanding and what the pay levels are. Now, where does this go? Well, one of the projects we're working on at the moment, which I have high hopes for, is essentially a Google Maps for jobs and skill. So how does Google Maps work? You put in your home or where you're starting, and you put in where you want to be, and it tells you your options for getting there by walking, cycling, car, train, and so on. We think the world needs equivalents for jobs and skills, where you can put in where you are, your current skills, your current job, and be helped to navigate through to the future. And we have live beta versions of these, which you can see on our website. So I've already shown you the forecasts. How likely is your job to be destroyed or still exist in 10 or 15 years' time? How vulnerable are you to trends? We can help you see what current vacant jobs are closest to your existing skill, which may be in quite surprising industries you wouldn't have thought of. And what we're trying to link this to now is an analysis of skills provision, so you can be shown what one extra skill would most increase your employability. And to do that, we call it open jobs as a commons, as a public service where all that data is linked together. But then the crucial point, of course, is that most people won't really be able to navigate even that on their own and will need help. And our work with many of the groups at most risk of the next 5 or 10 years, whether it's the 50-year-old working in a warehouse or the teenager who hasn't got many GCSEs, they need a human help to help them navigate through the data. So we've got the potential of a fantastic step change in the quality of the data, the analysis, but it only becomes valuable if there are human beings to help with the interpretation. And we're trying to get the government departments, the big companies like Google and LinkedIn, and cities to collaborate to make this a reality. Because at the moment, millions of people are not navigating their own choices well at all and have scarcely a clue what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So this is a really, a serious challenge. It's making many people just terrified of technology and AI and automation. They're not seeing the opportunities, but in some ways they're right to be terrified because they're not being given the help to become real agents in this story of change. So I guess my question to all of you, and perhaps for us to discuss, is what would the workplace, the world of work, which you all work in, what would it look like if it truly was collective intelligence, if it really could draw on the best available data, analyses, forecasts, but also tacit knowledge of people who may, for different reasons because of their situation, have a sense of what's going to be looked for in the future, what the real demands will be in a particular place or a particular sector. I think there is a possibility of creating that, but we're a very long way from it right now. And where it takes you to is what I think is, in a sense, a key leadership challenge of the next 10 years, which we're calling intelligence design. And essentially, it's the question of what are the skills you need to create the sort of things I just described in jobs, or to create the things I showed earlier on the environment, or epidemics, or a democracy which actually worked, simple things like that, which requires a combination of, yes, knowledge of the digital technologies, the AI, the data, but also knowledge of things like how you run meetings, knowledge of how you get human groups to think and work together. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I went around many of the top universities of the world, essentially asking them, have you got anyone who could help with that question? And not a single one did. They have very good computer science departments, psychology departments, business departments and organizational design, but not this kind of intelligence design. And really the design industry is not very helpful either. They're very good at designing objects and quite good at designing services, but not good at designing intelligence. So I think this is an emergent field, is not on our list of forecasts, but which will become crucial for almost any kind of leadership. And in a sense, I guess I would say the definition of true leadership in the future will be some ability to orchestrate, curate the full collective intelligence potential of the organization you're leading, or the sector, or the city. That would be the mark of the really good mayor in 5 or 10 years' time, not just that they're smart, make good decisions, have good people around them in City Hall, but that they can actually mobilize the entire intelligence of a London, a Manchester, an Edinburgh, a Bristol. That seems to be a good definition of political leadership. And the good business leader will be one, again, who can do that within their business, but also hopefully their wider network of stakeholders, suppliers, consumers, and others. And it will be a combination of at least understanding of data and algorithms and all of that sort of stuff, but it'll also be a deep understanding of humans, how they work, their motivations, their psychology, and their inner potential. And it's a slightly sad fact that rather a lot of our leaders at the moment are almost diametrically opposed to this vision and are, as it were, even parodies of a much more traditional notion of leadership where the leader just sort of intuits what they think the answer is and shouts it at the world and hopes the change happens, or indeed other leaders who are just completely bogged down in projects which may not be very useful anyway, but I won't comment on that. So this, in the short term, it may be the odds are a bit stacked against this, but I'm actually, you said I'm an optimist for the future, I think this is the direction of travel of the world. And there are now a fantastic array of places and organizations trying to become good at this. And my last meeting before coming here this afternoon was actually with a group from across the United Nations who are, in the first few months of next year, going to create, under the UNDP, which is the development program of the UN, what they're calling Sustainable Development Goal Accelerator Labs whose aim is to speed up the world's action to achieve the SDGs. That's things like access to water, gender equity, and so on, using collective intelligence methods. So some of these ideas, they may sound a bit theoretical, they are actually being put into practice in pretty energetic ways, say in the first 3 months of this year in 60 countries across the world. All of those countries are developing countries, and the interesting thing is we will probably then need to re-import those ideas from them, because they're not really being driven at the moment from our most powerful institutions, which are slightly locked in a pre-intelligence design mode. But maybe all of you can coach them to do better. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Fascinating and stimulating. And I'm now looking forward to an exposition of your collective intelligence in the question section. So we've got about 20 minutes for this, and it's going to work as follows. We have 2 mic runners. We have Millie over there and Sophie over there. If I could ask, please, that you wait till the microphone gets to you. Start by giving your name and then state your question clearly and concisely. Thank you. So, who would like to get the ball rolling?
Doesn't have to be a question, it could be violent disagreement.
Over here, please. Thank you.
Well, not violent, actually. Just disagreement.
Julian Phillips. First of all, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. I would like to pick up on really the last point that you were talking about in terms of intelligence design. And one of the challenges a really stupid organization will have in transforming itself into an intelligent one is that it might be too dumb to understand what tools it needs to use in order to effect that transformation, and might not understand many of the principles that you outlined. If you were to outline or identify one single thing that would most assist many of the dumbest organizations you've seen in starting on that journey, what would it be?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, usually a starting point often with organizations is to say some quite old things, that if you think of your organization's resources, sort of knowledge, informational resources, and just start asking where are the ones you're not tapping into. So most organizations won't be tapping into their own staff's insights or ideas at all. And a really nice example from this year, which we've been a bit involved in, is the Indian Railways. If any of you worked at the Indian Railways? An enormous organization, nearly 2 million employees, set up by the British on a military sort of command and control structure. And they've been experimenting with getting their junior staff to actually come up with ideas of improving track maintenance, station management, very practical things, and given them a process for then trying out their ideas in practice. And they've had tens of thousands of examples. They let them then present to the Indian president, so it got status. But that was essentially getting an organization to look at itself in terms of the resources it was throwing away and wasting. It hadn't tapped that brain power at all. Organizations, that's something they can get in the same way that tapping consumer insight or user insight is usually a good starting point, a good prompt, because there too is an underused sort of resource of intelligence. I think the biggest challenge for organizations, and I don't really still know how to deal with this, is that many of the things I'm talking about are thought of as sort of digital technology stuff. So they're given to the kind of, the IT team to do. And despite decades of trying to get knowledge, information, management integrated into organizations, it's still pretty patchy. So an organization like Amazon, in its own way, does this automatically. It thinks about everything in sort of systems information terms, but most organizations don't. And so it's sort of left to a slightly lower status department, which then comes up with, kit and software and apps and so on, but not really getting back to the fundamentals of intelligence design.
Question, Bill.
Bill Critchley, drawing on your optimistic attitude, I think you could take mobilizing collective intelligence as a wonderful purpose for people like me, for coaches. But it does seem to me that the culture of organizations is stubbornly antithetical to that, in that even among the technical leaders, power resides at the top. They're very hierarchical. You see the same amount of inhibition of collective intelligence below that I've been seeing for 30 years. So I'm just wondering how your optimism, where you might see that shifting, what might lead to a shift in this kind of implacable tendency for people to take up power and hierarchy and prevent really a collective intelligence.
Yeah, some days I'm optimistic, some days I'm not. It's like, depends which day of the week it is, really, or what's happened. And there's definitely trends going in the wrong direction in that respect. I would hope that there is a sort of a cultural, a long-term cultural shift, and certainly in the organisations I know, the millennials kind of expect a say on things and are pretty resistant to traditional hierarchy and deference. I hope there's an efficiency effect. The organisations which are better at harnessing their collective intelligence over time do better than the ones which don't. I hope we as citizens become unwilling to put up with bad ways, bad practices and bad cultures. And then I think the key comes down to detailed design. So let me just give one example which may surprise you. The US Supreme Court, quite in the news recently. They have a very nice little device, I think this is true, whereby on any discussion, the most junior member of the court, who's now, of course, Brett Kavanaugh, speaks first. Because one of the real problems in any organizational meeting, if the most powerful person speaks first, they kind of anchor the discussion and set it on its way. So it's a really useful, very simple device for countering that distorting effect of power and hierarchy. Always get the least powerful person to speak first. And there are other things you can do like that, on meeting design, where you give junior people the role of chairing it or summing up. Or there's all sorts of quite detailed practical design tools which help then to embed a radically different culture of collective intelligence. And again, that's why I'm so keen on using the language of design. It's not just the sort of the broad brush. It's how we embed this in everyday detail, which really matters.
Question at the very back, or the lady in the black top. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I work in organisational development at King's College London. Now, you mentioned something about our education system not preparing our future leaders, workers, community of thinkers for the world that's ahead. What do you think we need to do now to change that system?
Well, there's a chapter in my book all about universities. So I have lots of prejudices about universities, which are wonderful institutions in many ways. And actually, Britain's top universities remain amongst the top in the world. But in a way, that's their problem. They're so successful, so high status. King's, you have people come from all over the world. You've massively grown. You've got vast capital budgets. You don't really need to rethink what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, because the old model, in some ways, is so successful. So I've become increasingly interested in different ways of thinking about the university through a collective intelligence lens, and I set them out in the book. And I'll just give 2 or 3 bits of flavour of that. One is to in a sense, really shift away from disciplinary silos for at least part of the university life. And here, we did a project with Tsinghua University in Beijing, which had a very pioneering president, Chen Jining, who's now actually mayor of Beijing, who, in a way, perhaps it was easier to see from China, he thought they weren't creating the kinds of people the society needed. They got 1,000 applicants for every place at Tsinghua, absolutely brilliant people, fantastic physics, computer science, engineering faculties, but not the right kinds of human being he thought his society needed. And To create them, the idea we came up, which was called Open Fiesta, some of the same letters as NESTA, was that you would get your undergraduates doing about up to half their degree working on real-life projects, practical problem solving, on the frontiers of science, but also the frontiers of social innovation in the city, working in a cross-disciplinary way, working with real clients and partners, and through that, learning faster about their underlying disciplines, because you'd have to apply them, but at the same time, learning about leadership, collaboration, social change, all these other things, and hopefully internalizing an ethos of service to society. We proposed this idea to the British universities. None has quite taken it up, but there are quite a few around the world who are doing bits of this, from Aalto in Finland to Monterrey in Mexico, bits of Stanford. And if you're interested, there was a good piece The Economist ran on this a year or two ago. So that's one way of rethinking the university in terms of cultivation of its students. But of course, when it does that, when the university does that, it's automatically embedding itself in its community and its society and its economy. It's not thinking of itself as having walls. It's become porous and part of really the cognitive system of the city it's part of. So that would be a nice, perhaps, challenge for King's. How could King's be part of, London's collective intelligence, using all the tools which are now around? And you probably wouldn't end up, I would say, most universities around the world are incredibly, isomorphic. They all have, 3 or 4 year courses, lecture halls, PhDs, blah, blah, blah. Almost every element, which was defined well over a century ago, has essentially survived in new universities as well as old ones, with the new elements being pretty marginal. But I think it's worth every now and again just thinking, if you were starting from scratch, what would you do?
Yeah, in the middle, here, Sophie.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Mooney. I'm wondering and curious about the role for the disruptive thinker within a collective intelligence setup. And what I'm thinking about is, drive towards consensus and continuous sort of step-by-step improvement rather than big bang innovation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, and so that's maybe the other side of the university role in science and in the arts and other fields, is if you want really breakthrough thinking, you need to insulate people from the crowd. So almost the worst thing a creative person can do is be on social media every day, and many of them are. There's a lot of science of this, which shows how any truly novel, radical idea needs safe space to incubate itself away from commentary and criticism and peers and so on. And actually, this also relates to the role of meeting design. So, one of the fascinating things about meetings is the brainstorm. The brainstorm was being researched for, I think, the 1950s, the first big research studies on the brainstorm came out, showing that brainstorms are a really bad way to come up with ideas. And you might be better just having a walk or sitting in the bath, as anything else, and yet it's ignored. So it's a key point, you say, in order to sort of novelty and ideas which truly challenge a consensus have to be externalized. So Hegel, probably none of you read the philosopher Hegel, but he actually wrote about this best in the early 19th century, about the dialectic. Sorry, I'm getting a bit philosophical. I may lose all of you here, but it's he showed how within any, and he was talking about reason, any sort of new ideas had to literally externalize themselves from the community, to go out intellectually, socially in every respect, often to then be rejected or opposed by, but then they would be reintegrated in a new form, and through that reintegration, its thesis, antithesis, synthesis, human progress happened. So, in a sense, the personal choice then is, do you want to be an externalizer, which often involves risk and sacrifice and social rejection, but you may have a bigger effect in the long run, or do you want to be part of the collective and the group? And so I think in any, say, healthy system, you do have a space for all of those. And to go back to the universities, any healthy university system has to have some people given the freedom not to be accountable at all, for anything.
We've got time maybe for a couple more questions. Lady with the black top there, hand up, thank you.
Thank you. Lucy Hackshaw. I'm investing a lot of time and money in understanding the future of work, the human economy, and the human attributes we'll need to prosper alongside disruptive technologies. The results so far reveals a mindset of curiosity is critical to that, and I think what it's also showing is that it enables empathy and cognitive flexibility, which will be important to upskilling in new spaces, particularly for leaders that are kind of fighting high cortisol levels and allostatic load. So how does that align with what you know about curiosity, and how do you cultivate curiosity at NESTA?
So I'll absolutely agree with you, and some of the words I put up there are different ways of saying curiosity, so fluency of ideas, openness to originality, etc., does appear to be a pretty important attribute in all sorts of roles, say including like construction or plumbing or care. You know, it's not like these will just be the preserve of fashion and design and advertising. And so the question then, how do you cultivate them, is really important. And about once a month now for the last year and a half it has been, I've done sessions with year 9s in secondary schools, talking to them about the future work. And I strongly encourage, if any of you don't, try and offer yourself to your local schools. And I did one last week. And what's really surprising then, maybe it's not surprising to you, is they've clearly never had that conversation in any other part of the school life. The teachers, with the best will in the world, don't know about the future of work. It's not their skill. And so these kids are really slightly bereft, these teenagers, of ways of thinking about what they need to thrive through the next few decades of potentially quite turbulent labour markets, job creation, and disappearance. And we've actually just produced some stuff for teachers to help teachers run sessions on the future world of work. And in a way, I think the answers to how you cultivate curiosity, I mean, teenagers are incredibly curious. That's, in a way, the problem is their curiosity is often squeezed out rather than that it's not there. But I suspect some of the methods are a little bit like, you know, for universities. You need them to have more chances to work on real life problem solving, ideally doing it in teams with others, ideally in ways that get them out of the school building, so they're dealing with, you know, local small businesses or the council or whatever, and having some freedom also to pursue their passion, their curiosity, the things, you know, ask them what 10 things would you like to know about how they work in your town that you don't know the answer to. Little exercises like that then give you a set of questions and then turn that into a project. And they're not hard to do because, as I say, teenagers tend to be, you know, highly curious about the world, but a very, you know, GCSE knowledge transmission education model really does squeeze it out of them and discourage that originality, which is not at all good. But as I said, I think we've got a big problem. People like, actually, let me ask, how many of you have done a session in a secondary school in the last 12 months? Oh, you're a fantastic group. Okay. Well, I think it's really important you keep doing that because there's a missing bit, I think, for most children, just aren't having the chance to have that conversation. So in their newspaper, they read about robots and drones and so on, and they just get frightened. They think, you know, maybe there is no future for me. Maybe I will be much worse off than my parents. And it just feeds a kind of depressive fatalism, which is really unnecessary. I mean, I don't know what everything we look at in the future world of work says, yes, there are challenges and threats, but probably there will be as many jobs in 20 years' time as there are now. Probably the current futurologists who say all jobs will disappear are as wrong as the futurologists who said that in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. really important point. And probably that future labour market will have more opportunities, better jobs for most people than the current one. So there's reasons to be nervous, but not reasons to be fatalistic.
Thank you. I think there's a question down at the front somewhere. Oh.
I can handle negativity.
Do you still like to ask it? Okay. Can we, mic down here, please, Sophie?
Thank you. My name's Mark Woods. I'm excited about what you've talked about here, and I love the thought of collective intelligence, but I'm assuming that you need to have an awful lot of cognitive freedom to allow people to embrace that, but you've also have collective ignorance as well, I wrote down, and I'm interested how you mitigate against that collective ignorance that is maybe fueled by fake news or social media, and you end up with something like a president or a Boaty McBoatface or whatever, where people have thought that was a really good idea.
So, yeah, and this is a bit of the argument I missed out, but I think it's I see this almost as a war underway between collective intelligence and collective stupidity, and which it's an arms race between the two. And the biggest threats are not so much ignorance, actually, it's knowing the wrong things. It's distortion, disinformation, disruption. And the reason is that in any situation, it could be within an organization or a whole society, there will always be interests, powerful interests, who want people to have the wrong facts or come to the wrong conclusions. And they may have access to very powerful communication channels, a newspaper, social media, and so on. Or they may be, literally trying to send, worms to disrupt your computing system. So we are, I think, now in a much more obvious battleground, at which the forces of light need to become much tougher and much more aggressive, actually, in fighting the forces of darkness, like fake news, and the fact that we are now having discussions about law and regulation to change that environment is crucially important. You cannot have collective intelligence if most people are getting incorrect facts and aren't being given the means to distinguish them. So this is a hugely important battleground. What the Russians have been doing all over the world is an outrage, and the West has been much too slow to really fight it, to get its intelligence agencies doing like for like, but I think that's just beginning to change. We have to skill kids up, again, the teenagers, so they know how to spot when someone is manipulating and misleading them. And we've just, next week, publishing a thing on how next year, slightly joking, but not really, may have the world's first big sort of diplomatic incident over a faked video of a world leader saying something. So already it's quite easy to create these sort of fake videos, and some technologists are designing tools to spot the fake videos, but that's exactly where the arms race is at. So I'm not actually complacent on that one at all. But in the chapter on this in my book, I actually go back to some great traditions of thinking about this, starting actually with the Buddha. There's a fantastic sermon the Buddha made to a group of people in the 6th century BC, in which he tells them essentially, don't believe a word I say. Don't believe anyone. Cultivate your capacity to distinguish truth from falsehood. And there are other people like Michael Faraday, scientist in the 19th century, again, who gave brilliant speeches which could have been made today about how to cultivate the mindset of healthy skepticism and doubt in order to get to truth. And in a way, we don't need to reinvent the underlying ideas. They are deep in our civilization. We just need some new technology tools to help us fight against the enemies of collective intelligence, who at the moment are looking quite powerful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of the time, so I'd like to say thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Geoff, for your answers. And at this point, I'd like to invite Eleanor McBrien from our kind host, the Alliance, just to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Good evening, everybody. Gosh, there's lots of you. So as Daniel said, my name is Eleanor McBrien, and I am, along with Daniel and 8 of my gorgeous colleagues, a partner at the Alliance. And I'd just like to collectively embarrass them by asking them to stand up, turn round, give you a little Mexican wave, so you know who they are. So my job here is to give a vote of thanks to Geoff for that extraordinary talk. I'm still processing. I kept on thinking, I could say that, then I could say, I'm still processing it all, so I won't have anything particularly pithy or intelligent to say. But collective intelligence actually is very close to our hearts at the Alliance because we're a partnership of coaches. So the principle that 8 brains are better than 1 when it comes to the work that we do with our clients is actually one of our founding principles. And I'm really struck by the need for us to constantly understand how the market is changing, how data is changing, and we can't be complacent to understand the world our clients are working in and the way that we challenge ourselves. So it's a good challenge to have. But mainly I can tell that the big data point in the room at the moment is about getting a drink. So I won't go on for too long. Before we ask you to join us in the atrium for some refreshments, can I ask you first to join me in thanking Geoff for a fantastic talk. Thank you.